He stepped off the train into a sea of strangers and never walked back. The station swallowed him, an ocean of uniforms, suitcases, porters, and vendors. And in the hours that followed, he simply ceased to exist for his family. That small vanishing would, in the years to come, become the first thread pulled loose in a pattern of disappearance and discovery that would chill Hanover and force the city to look at itself in the mirror. Uncovering the secrets of the Hanover Vampire begins with that single image: a boy on a platform, uncertain and alone, and a man who offered help. The man's name appears in the records as Fritz. His surname is recorded variously in surviving documents and in newspaper accounts, often inconsistent enough that historians flag it indefinido. The ambiguity around names and dates is a constant in this story. More than once, what people remembered as fact would fray when compared to reports and court transcripts. What holds steady, though, are the disappearances, the discoveries, and the trail of fear they left behind. Sources and how to suggest a story are in the description. Hanover in the immediate aftermath of the Great War is essential to understand this case. The city was not wounded alone. Germany was reeling. Soldiers returned to streets that no longer recognized them. Families wrestled with loss and poverty. Markets that had once traded predictably now moved in shadow and improvisation. Thousands of young people, boys and girls, were displaced. Some came from the countryside seeking work in the cities. Some were the children of families devastated by the war and by inflation. Others were adolescents who had fled abuse or an impossible home. The term runaway in contemporary reports carries a casual cruelty. These were young people whose social supports had collapsed. At the Hanover Central Station, the name itself suffused in the sources with variations and the occasional indefinido token, the platform was a crossroads. It was a place where strangers met and made brief bargains. A job lead, a warm meal, a bed for the night. Vendors shouted their wares, carts creaked. An exhausted mother might stare after a child who wandered too far. In that noise, predation could hide in plain sight. Local markets, including a busy one recorded in several sources under a name rendered as Shaber or Indefinido, were another element of the city's post-war economy. The black market thrived there. Essentials, clothing, sometimes food. With shortages and rationing, people turned to whatever means could feed their families. The law enforcement apparatus, already weakened and undermanned after the war, was strained. Patrols were thin, records were inconsistent, and the social stigma toward homeless or runaway youth meant that missing person reports did not always receive the urgency they deserved. Into that fractured urban environment stepped Fritz. He appears in the records intermittently, as a man who loitered near the station, as someone who posed as helpful, and as a personality that several neighbors described in tones that ranged from uneasy to openly frightened once the pattern of disappearances took shape. His biographical trail is fragmentary. He had been in and out of institutions early in life, according to court documents and the testimonies assembled during the investigation. Contemporary files suggest a childhood marked by instability, family breakdown, brushes with petty crime, and an escalating set of behaviors that made neighbors uncomfortable. At some point, officials note psychiatric detention. At other points, they describe escapes or brief releases. Those records are blunt, custodial, and colored by the era's limited understanding of mental health. They sketch a man who moved between marginalized roles in the city: occasional laborer, a helper at the station, someone who knew the rhythms of lost youth. The first disappearance that would later be connected to Fritz is the case of a teenage boy, known in the sources as Fredel. Again, a name that appears in variant forms, and which, in some files, is tagged indefinido. Accounts place his arrival at the station in late 1918. He was young enough to be mistaken for a child by the crowd, frightened enough to accept a stranger's offer of guidance. Witnesses later described seeing him speak with a middle-aged man who had the air of someone used to moving among travelers. He was seen walking with the man toward the part of the city that housed cheap lodgings and boarding rooms. The boy's family reported him missing only after hours. The initial police response amounted to a report and a promise to alert patrols. That promise, for reasons that would become painfully evident, was not fulfilled in ways that mattered. Investigators and journalists who returned to the case years later would point to several missed opportunities. In some instances, officers took statements but did not follow up on leads that, today, would seem obvious. Checking the station's nearby rooms, cross-referencing transient lodgers, interviewing market sellers who might have noticed odd arrivals and departures. In other instances, the bureaucracy itself stumbled. Records went missing, witness recollections hardened into contradictory versions, and priorities shifted away from tracking a missing child to managing larger civil unrest and public safety crises. Families, exhausted and often impoverished, were left to search on their own. The pattern that would later be associated with Fritz emerged gradually. He learned the rhythms of the station. When trains arrived heavy with people, which carriages emptied onto the platform in the morning, where vendors sold cheap coffee and buns. He learned to look like a helper. Witnesses would come forward to describe the same fundamental approach, a man who addressed runaways with a tone of authority or sympathy, sometimes offering work, sometimes offering shelter for the night. The pretext varied, but the lure was consistent. A solution presented to someone who had no other options. Where Fritz took his victims and what happened there became one of the grim signatures of the case. Contemporary records and later court evidence described that he brought several young people back to his lodging, a cramped apartment above a modest trade or workshop. From those premises, the files indicate the attacks took place. The most recurring detail in police statements is the method. Victims were attacked at the throat. The investigators used language that, while clinical, carries the full weight of severity, describing harm to the windpipe and fatal injuries consistent with a deliberate assault aimed at silencing and disabling. Newspaper accounts, keen to attract readers, often adopted shorthand that sensationalized these descriptions. Court transcripts and medical testimony were more measured, focusing on cause of death rather than lurid imagery. Around these confirmed details, rumor proliferated. In the market and in taverns, whispers suggested something darker, that parts of the victims had been sold as meat on the black market. Contemporary investigators treated these claims with caution in their files, and modern historians have continued that caution. The claim is an unverified local rumor. No physical evidence produced in the police dossiers conclusively proved the sale of human flesh in market stalls. When such rumors circulated, they did so because they filled a public need to explain how and where a community's missing members could vanish so completely. Rumors do not equal proof, and the files insistently remind us of this boundary. Speculation must be marked as speculation. Fritz's resume of petty offenses and institutionalizations sheds light on how he moved through Hanover's margins without being stopped. Early in life, he had been noted in municipal records for minor thefts and disturbances. He was at one point admitted to a psychiatric institution. Later entries claim he absconded or was released. The language used by officials in that era reveals biases and gaps in treatment. Contemporary psychiatrists and later examiners would look at those records and point to signs of severe dysfunction. But without the forensic tools available today, they could do little beyond containment and, occasionally, punitive measures. Whether the system's failure lay in release policies, in the lack of follow-up, or in the simple fact that resources were scarce, is a debate threaded through subsequent inquiries. For families like Fritz's, the response from authorities was painfully inadequate. Parents who went to the police were often asked to wait, to keep an eye out, to return with more precise descriptions of clothing or last known movements, details that, for young runaways, could shift with the moment. Community efforts, posters, word-of-mouth searches, neighbors standing watch, were not enough to substitute for a systematic search. The sense among many contemporaries was that the city had too many fractures. Officials tending to riots and unemployment, police stretched thin, social services non-existent. A child could disappear on a platform and be downplayed as a runaway who would resurface in a week or a month. That institutional shrug, whether intentional or structural, bought time for further predation. As the pattern of disappearances continued, the city's unease mutated into fear. Paths once taken without thought were now avoided after dusk. Parents kept children near. The rumor mill grew, amplified by papers that sought headlines and neighbors who needed to make sense of the inexplicable. The press, too, had its own hunger. Copies of regional newspapers show a steady increase in coverage only when the story could be framed as a series, an identifiable villain, a recurring method. That same press coverage, however, sometimes undermined serious inquiry by amplifying unverified claims or presenting speculation as fact. It became harder to separate reliable leads from the noise. When Fritz was first brought to official attention as a suspect, the initial hope among detectives was that they had caught a dangerous man before more lives were lost. Early interviews and arrest records indicate that officers had grounds to detain him. Multiple witnesses placed him with missing youths. Some belongings of missing persons were reportedly linked to him, and his living situation matched the pattern investigators were tracing. Yet even this arrest did not amount to a decisive end. The legal machinery moved slowly. Investigations were piecemeal, and the world's attention drifted between emerging crises. In a grim irony, Fritz's capacity to slip through the net, the same porousness that had allowed him to lure and harm, was amplified by a system that could not consolidate the evidence against him rapidly. His accomplice, a man identified in records as Hans with a surname often fragmented and therefore marked indefinido in reviews, occupies a more ambiguous place in the narrative. Witnesses and later confessions paint him at times as an active participant and at other times as a less involved presence, someone who aided or someone who was present and complicit by silence. The court records are valances of uncertainty, statements steeped in pressure, confessions that contradicted one another, and later recantations. Where the facts diverge, historians have been careful to delineate what is proven in court from what remained a matter of debate. In the public imagination, Hans and Fritz would be paired. In the legal record, the degree of Hans's culpability would be contested. The mechanics of how investigators began to connect dots is a study in persistence, luck, and the painstaking labor of police work at its most basic. Detectives followed leads: a lodging house owner who remembered a young boy arriving with a man, a vendor who recalled selling bread to a group that never returned, a porter who noticed muddy boots leaving a certain flat in the middle of the night. Gradually, scattered testimonies coalesced into a prosecutable narrative. The decision to place Fritz under surveillance came only after a collection of such small affirmations of pattern, enough to convince authorities that observation would produce incriminating evidence. At the same time, society's contagion of rumor continued to spread, and not all of it was harmless. Gossip about black market meat persisted, perhaps because it provided a concrete horror to explain otherwise incomprehensible loss. Some investigators briefly pursued those leads, inspecting market stalls and questioning butchers who worked in the irregular economy. Their reports, however, return with the same refrain. No definitive proof was found linking market sales to human remains. Certain market vendors, overwhelmed and defensive, pointed instead at the same social conditions that allowed for predation: the desperation of customers, the anonymity of trades, and the breakdown of normal supply chains. The files therefore hold two truths in uneasy coexistence: a set of credible, confirmed crimes, and a set of circulating explanations that could not be substantiated in court. One of the most harrowing features of this affair is how often close calls were missed. In at least one reported incident, a neighbor described hearing a disturbance in the night and, worried about consequences, hesitated to go look. A shop clerk reported seeing a young person limping away from the direction of Fritz's lodging, but dismissed the sighting as a drunken passerby. Each small inaction accumulated into a meaningful absence, an absence that, in retrospect, became the difference between life and death for the missing. Fritz's apartment itself, when investigators finally secured it, presented a portrait of ordinary domesticity marred by clues. Court filings detail seized items that later became central to the case: clothing that witnesses associated with missing youths, bedding that had been recently washed, and implements whose presence raised questions among investigators. Importantly, the files do not depict a theatrical lair. Rather, they show a cramped, utilitarian living space, typical of someone eking out a living in the city. That ordinariness was part of what made the crimes so pernicious. Predation often hides within the mundane. Medical testimony in later hearings gave shape to the violence in formal terms. Forensic physicians explained how injuries to the throat could be fatal in ways that prevented victims from calling for help. Their language was precise, clinical, and constrained, a deliberate choice in both medical testimony and the legal process to avoid sensationalism. They described cause of death in terms of structural failure, not in lurid detail. Even as evidence accumulated, confessions would complicate the narrative. In custody, both men made statements, some clear, some contradictory. Fritz's admissions, where they occurred, aligned with the core pattern of luring and attacking vulnerable youths. Hans's statements varied, at times implicating himself, at others minimizing his role or assigning responsibility to Fritz alone. The motives ascribed in these statements oscillated between practical explanations, covering needs, securing room and board, and darker impulses that the law of the time described without full psychological nuance. Whatever the mixture of motives, the human cost was incontrovertible. Families missing children, communities thick with suspicion, and a police force under the public eye. By the early 1920s, the city had grown increasingly restless for a resolution. Press coverage intensified. Neighbors demanded action. Investigators, pressed into motion, revised old files and re-interviewed witnesses whose memories were now recast by months or years of worry. The legal calculus shifted from mere containment to prosecution. Yet even as the state readied its case, the social conditions that had enabled the crimes remained mostly unaddressed. Impoverished youth still wandered, markets still operated with little oversight, and police resources were limited by the very fiscal crises that had followed the war. Then, in a year recorded across sources as 1924, the case took a public turn no one could have ignored. Children playing near the banks of a river, named in some documents as the Lena River and in others rendered indefinito, found bones. The discovery began with fragments, then revealed more, an array of skeletal remains that could not be dismissed as the detritus of old burials. These were clearly associated with recent loss and stirred a city that had, until then, wrestled with disappearance as a shadow crime, something whispered and suspected. To find bones in a river is to make the invisible visible. To drag a secret from the stream is to demand answers. The first reports were tentative. Local press covered the find with a mix of human sorrow and investigative urgency. Police crews, called to the site, began the grim work of recovery. They catalogued, photographed, and tried to match fragments with missing persons reports. For families who had been waiting, sometimes for years, the river's unearthing offered a horrific form of closure, a confirmation that loss had not been ephemeral. For investigators, it provided the physical evidence that could bridge rumor and prosecutable fact. Once bones were recovered and catalogued, outside detectives were invited in. The case had outgrown local capacity. Specialists who could map missing persons to remains, and who understood the forensic possibilities of the day, were pressed into service. Their arrival signaled that the city's authorities could no longer contain this as a local problem with only local remedies. The presence of external investigators also pressured the legal process to be thorough. Evidence from the river, combined with witness testimony and artifacts seized from Fritz's residence, began to form a more complete narrative. Yet even with this new, visible evidence, courts would later have to wrestle with uncertainties. Some remains could be tied to missing boys through personal effects or dental records where available. Others remained anonymous, scattered by water and time. Medical examiners offered what conclusions they could. Prosecutors framed their charges by linking recovered bones to specific disappearances when possible, and to the broader pattern where not. Defense teams worked to create reasonable doubt, pointing to the fragmentary nature of water-worn evidence and to contradictions in witness statements. The river discovery marked a turning point in public attention and in the prosecution's momentum. It was the moment when the city could not simply plead ignorance or delay. Yet it also deepened certain moral questions. How had a society grown so brittle that so many youths had fallen through its protective nets? How much of the responsibility rested with an individual, and how much with a system that failed to shield its most vulnerable? Those questions would recur through the trial, through the files, and in public debate. At the riverbank, the recovering teams also confronted the everyday mechanics of historical evidence. Decomposition that obscured identity, the river's currents scattering traces, and the simple fact that the passage of years had eroded testimony. The detectives pressed forward nonetheless, mapping a gruesome geography of find spots and trying to reconstruct movement, where a body might have been brought, how it could have entered the water, what sites upstream might be associated. Their work was sobering, methodical, and, by the standards of the day, painstaking. The discovery prompted renewed scrutiny of Fritz's apartment and of the neighborhood more broadly. Witnesses who had been silent now spoke. Some, perhaps prodded by guilt or by media attention, offered recollections that helped fill gaps in the timeline. Others clung to their old narratives, small individual acts of denial that, in the macro sense, accounted for how long predation could go unchecked. For detectives assembling a case, every newly spoken memory was a potential key. Even as investigators pieced together the physical evidence and testimony, the community's grief and anger showed itself in practical ways. Families erected small memorials. Mothers petitioned local leaders. Neighborhood associations demanded that the authorities do more to protect children. Some of these responses were immediate and local. Others reverberated through the newspapers and into the parliamentary debates about public safety and the rehabilitative capacity of the state. The Hanover affair became more than a crime story. For a time, it was a touchstone in conversations about post-war social responsibility. But the river had not yet given up all its secrets. Bones could be recovered and analyzed, but the full story of who had been taken, when, and how would require more than science. It would require cross-disciplinary work, interviews, corroboration, a careful sifting of rumor from evidence. The city, under pressure, accelerated efforts. Detectives expanded their canvas. Investigative teams pursued any lead that might tie a found fragment to a known missing person. Each item recovered from the river became a locus of hope and dread. For some families, confirmation. For others, another layer of uncertainty. As the evidence mounted, the question of motive became harder to answer conclusively. Psychologists and physicians called to the case later pointed to recorded behaviors and to early institutional notes that suggested serious pathology in Fritz's life. Some medical observations recorded in later post-mortem materials, brief mentions of an inflamed brain, or signs associated with meningitis, for instance, appear in the files. Those observations are clinical notes, not verdicts of causation. They are reasons to investigate further, not to conclude. The legal and scientific standards of the time constrained what could be asserted confidently. Contemporary readers must therefore treat claims about medical causes with caution. Reported signs do not necessarily explain culpability. At the hinge of discovery, the city had to confront its failures and its mistakes. The initial missteps, missed interviews, delayed searches, dismissive attitudes toward runaways, were now not merely anecdotes, but elements in a chain that allowed continued harm. In newspaper editorials and in private letters to officials, community members cataloged what had gone wrong and demanded reform. The calls ranged from increased police patrols at the station to broader social programs for displaced youth. Whether and how those reforms took root varied across the city's districts and across the years that followed. By the time detectives prepared to move from recovery into prosecution, the narrative had become complex. A cast of vulnerable victims, a man named Fritz whose record traced an arc of marginalization and violence, an ambiguous partner in Hans, a river that exposed what the city could not hide, and a community reeling from the revelation of what had been allowed to happen. The evidence so far felt, to many, like a slow unspooling, secrets drawn up from the water, from worn testimony, from clothing, and from half-remembered faces at the station. Yet even with these revelations, many details remained unsettled, and the most consequential chapters, trial, verdict, the fates of the accused and of the recovered remains, lay ahead. When investigators finally assembled their initial requisition for arrest warrants and formal charges, they did so knowing their work was provisional. Residue of uncertainty clung to the edges of their case. The river had given them bones, and the apartment had yielded artifacts. Witness statements had supplied the pattern, but the legal system demanded proof beyond pattern. To tie a particular missing child, in a particular month and year, to the physical remains and to the accused in a manner that would survive cross-examination. The task was monumental, given the passage of time, the scattered record-keeping practices of the era, and the human reluctance to sit and recall traumatic memories. The stakes were not merely legal. For families, the prospect of a trial held the possibility of an official accounting. For the city, it offered a moment of institutional redemption or of further humiliation. For the accused, it meant the full weight of the state's attention. For the public, the trial would be an event where rumor met evidence, and where the past would be publicly adjudicated. The river's finds had transformed the case from a series of disappearances into a visible crime with consequences. And yet, even as prosecutors prepared, the story remained stubbornly incomplete. Names in the files remained inconsistent. Some victims could not be identified. Some witness statements contradicted each other. Historians who later reviewed the case would spend years cross-checking what the newspapers had printed against the police ledgers, only to find the same tensions between certainty and speculation that had marked the investigation from the beginning. That unresolved quality is itself part of the Hanover narrative, a reminder that uncovering secrets does not always give us neat answers, and that some revelations force us to sit in the discomfort of partial knowledge. The river's bones had pulled the main secret toward daylight, but they had also splintered it into pieces that required patient work to assemble. Detectives scheduled further interviews. Forensic experts were asked to re-examine certain items. Families were summoned to attempt positive identification. The legal calendar was set. In the weeks that followed, Hanover would watch and wait as the machinery of investigation shifted gears into prosecution, and as the press prepared to make a national story of a local horror. If the city hoped that the trial would deliver clean closure, those involved in the case understood the opposite. The proceedings would lay bare both human culpability and institutional limits. What the river had exposed could not be put back. The community's grief, the family's demands for justice, and the state's duty to prosecute now had to be balanced against the historical ambiguities that had always complicated the record. The next steps would be technical, painful, and, for many, inevitably public. If this subject matters to you, consider joining and supporting the channel via Patreon or membership. Links are below. The calendar turned and the case moved from discovery to prosecution. What had been fragmentary testimony, salvage from riverbanks, and whispered suspicions crystallized into formal charges. Detectives who had spent months following small, stubborn leads now watched as clerks stamped warrants, as prosecutors assembled lists of counts, and as families took their places in a courtroom that felt, to many, like the city's only remaining theater for justice. The legal machinery of Hanover, flawed, overworked, and public, was suddenly the stage on which private grief would be made visible. The prosecution's brief leaned on three pillars: the river finds, witness testimony connecting missing youths to a man known as Fritz, surname recorded inconsistently and therefore flagged indefinido, and the physical evidence recovered from his lodging. Photographs of seized clothing, lists of personal effects found stashed in corners, and the catalogued fragments from the Lena River, rendered in some documents as indefinido, formed the backbone of the case. Prosecutors emphasized pattern and presence. Fritz occupied the station's margins. Fritz had contact with the missing. Fritz lived in a space that contained items linked to those who would not be seen again. In court, this pattern was presented not as poetic symmetry, but as logical accumulation. Link after link. A chain meant to withstand the defense's efforts to break it. Families of the missing were given a public forum for the first time. Parents sat in the gallery and recounted the last images they had of sons who had stepped onto platforms, who had waved from platforms, who had melted into urban crowds. Their testimony was raw but restrained, They did not invent drama, they offered detail, an overcoat, a scar, a favored cap that might connect an identity to a fragment of bone or a trampled shoe. For many, the trial was an attempt to convert private loss into legal fact, to turn a memory into something that courts could quantify, a name, a date, a charge. Medical experts took the stand with a deliberate clinical cadence. They described wounds in the language of cause and effect, injuries to the throat consistent with force applied to the windpipe, hemorrhage and asphyxiation as proximate mechanisms of death. Their testimony avoided the lurid metaphors that had swelled in the popular press. Instead, the courtroom heard measured explanations intended to anchor emotion to evidence. When asked about the state of the recovered bones, examiners explained the limits of identification, erosion by water, missing teeth, and the routine degradation that can render certainty elusive. When possible, they paired fragments with clothing and personal effects, buttons, pieces of fabric, a watch chain, and it was this associative method that strengthened the prosecution's narrative in several counts. Confessions and statements complicated rather than simplified the trial. In custody, Fritz had given statements that at times aligned with investigators' reconstruction and at other times diverged. He spoke in fragments, in denials, in moments of apparent resignation. Hans, a man whose surname is likewise inconsistent in the surviving dossier, and therefore recorded as indefinido, offered versions that changed over time. Initial admissions, later minimizations, and occasional recantations. The defense used these contradictions to argue coercion, to question interrogation techniques, and to frame doubt. The prosecution countered with corroborative testimony, neighbors who observed arrivals and departures, vendors who remembered certain patrons, and the physical links between personal items and the accused's living quarters. Press galleries swelled. Papers nationwide treated the case as more than local crime. Headlines framed it as a moral panic, as proof of a social rupture, and as an instance where both state and citizenry had failed vulnerable youth. Reporters recounted courtroom scenes in florid prose while the legal transcripts remained painstakingly sober. The tension between sensational reporting and judicial restraint was itself a piece of the trial's drama. Outside the court, a city demanded a villain. Inside it, a court weighed evidence against standards of proof. When the verdicts were delivered, they were heavy in both number and consequence. Fritz was convicted on multiple counts. Contemporary records in the archives indicate a conviction for 24 murders, an aggregate figure that later historians have retained, while noting variation in how specific counts were assigned to particular recovered remains. The court sentence was death by guillotine, a form of capital punishment used in several parts of Europe at the time, and one that, in Hanover's contemporary newspapers, was described with clinical brevity rather than salacious detail. Hans's fate was more contested. Initially sentenced to death, his conviction would later be revisited. Subsequent proceedings, appeals, and legal reappraisals resulted in a retrial for Hans that reduced his penalty to long terms of imprisonment. The disparate outcomes, final for one defendant, reduced for the other, reflected both the evidentiary complexities and the unevenness of witness accounts that underpinned the case. Executions and sentences did not erase the deeper questions that had emerged. After Fritz's conviction, the state ordered a post-mortem examination. Medical examiners documented what they found in restrained clinical language. Among the notations in the files are references to inflammation and to certain pathological signs in brain tissue. One line item, recorded in a manner that requires careful reading, mentions signs consistent with meningitis or its after-effects. Those notes exist as clinical observations, not causal explanations. Legal and medical authorities of the era were cautious. To record a condition is not to ascribe to it the cause of violent acts. Modern readers, too, must resist the temptation to translate pathology into motive. Reports of Fritz's brain condition were used by some contemporaries to suggest an explanation for his behavior. By others, they were a neutral medical fact, stripped of interpretive weight. The files themselves reflect that ambivalence. The physical fate of Fritz's remains is another element of the case that invites both curiosity and careful restraint. Some institutional records and later press accounts indicate that portions of his skull and certain post-mortem materials were preserved, apparently retained for study or record. The archival trail here is uneven, and historians caution that precise details about the disposition of remains and their storage sites require verification from primary institutional records. Where contemporary sources are unclear or names are garbled, the correct practice is to flag uncertainty, rather than to fill it with speculation. Thus, the preservation of anatomical material, while noted in several secondary accounts, should be treated with caution until corroborated by museum or hospital logs. Whatever the material outcome, the attention to his body after death speaks to the era's intersection of criminal justice, emerging medical inquiry, and public curiosity. The trial's aftermath rippled across Hanover in quieter but persistent ways. Debates that had been rhetorical prior to the river fines hardened into policy recommendations and political action. Citizens called for stronger patrols at the central station. Some local councils experimented with night shelters and registration systems for displaced youth. Newspapers printed editorials urging the improvement of municipal services. Yet the implementation of reform followed the familiar uneven path of post-crisis governance. Some districts saw modest increases in social provision. Others saw little change beyond a temporary uptick in policing. Competing priorities, economic constraints, political instability, and the sheer scale of post-war dislocation meant that systemic reform was slow and incomplete. Historians who later studied the case have underscored that legal closure did not equate to social resolution. Convictions provided accountability on an individual level, but they did not magically repair the networks of poverty, displacement, and institutional neglect that had allowed predation to persist. Families who received legal confirmation of loss nonetheless had to navigate grief against a backdrop of economic hardship and social stigma. Some communities made memorials for the missing. Others receded into silence. The memory of the events moved between private mourning and public debate, sometimes remembered as a cautionary tale about the dangers of rumor, sometimes as an indictment of civic negligence. The interplay between rumor and evidence remained a cautionary thread. The most persistent, unverified claim, that human remains had been sold as cheap meat in market stalls, was investigated by authorities prior to and during the trial. Formal inspections of markets and questioning of butchers and vendors did occur. Those investigative records returned a consistent refrain: no conclusive proof linked sales in the market to human remains. The rumor's endurance, however, reveals more about communal psychology than about forensic reality. In a time when ordinary avenues for sustenance were disrupted, the public seized upon a lurid explanation that could account for disappearances. Where evidence stopped, narrative rushed in. The case therefore serves as a study in how communities invent explanations as a form of control over chaos, an understandable but often misleading human response. There were 2 formal inquiries into the failures that had allowed predation to continue. Records of municipal reviews and parliamentary correspondence in the years after the trial show a range of recommendations: better record-keeping at railway stations, standardized procedures for missing person reports, coordination between municipal and adjacent rural police forces, and, in some proposals, the establishment of support centers for displaced youths. Implementation varied, and rigorous assessment of long-term impact is difficult. What is clear from the surviving correspondence is an emergent recognition that policing alone could not be the remedy. Social services and community structures had to be part of any sustainable solution. In the decades that followed, the Hanover affair took on different meanings. For criminologists, it became a case study in how war and social breakdown can create predatory opportunities. For sociologists, it illustrated the cultural processes by which rumor fills evidentiary voids. For families and community members, it remained a source of sorrow and a caution to watch over children in times of instability. Public memory did not treat the story uniformly. Some chroniclers emphasized the villainy of an individual. Others stressed systemic culpability. Museums and local histories included the events as part of a broader narrative about the city's recovery from war. Yet the details, names, specific dates, and local topography, often required the caveat indefinido, where the archival record had frayed. What, then, are the secrets uncovered by this investigation? Some were material and concrete: bones pulled from a river, items seized from a lodging that connected victims to an accused man, court records that lay out charges and sentences. Those discoveries transformed suspicion into legal consequence. Other secrets were less tidy. They were the failures cataloged in internal police notes, missed follow-ups, delayed searches, and the bureaucratic inertia that gave an opportunist space. They were the social secrets, the ways poverty and displacement make certain populations invisible until their absence becomes too large to ignore. Those are harder to litigate, but no less important to name. Finally, there are the ambiguous, unsettled traces that resist tidy resolution, the inconsistent paperwork that forces historians to mark indefinido beside a name, the medical notations that mention inflammation without supplying motive, the market rumors that persist despite lack of proof. These are not mere annoyances to a historian. They are reminders of the limits of archival truth and of our ethical duty to distinguish between what can be demonstrated and what must remain provisional. The Hanover affair, when seen from the vantage of years, is not simply the story of a man or a pair of men who preyed upon a vulnerable population. It is also a mirror held up to a society in flux, a society whose institutions had been weakened by war, whose economy forced people into precarious choices, and whose moral narratives were stretched by rumor and fear. The river revealed what had been hidden. The trial assigned individual culpability. But the deeper lesson is about the systems that fail people before predators can. Uncovering the secrets of the Hanover Vampire thus means not only naming the crimes and bringing perpetrators to account, but also tracing the social contours that made such crimes possible. As the city moved on, slowly, imperfectly, families carried their losses into new routines. Communities debated reforms that would take years to materialize. Historians kept returning to the files, to the riverbank, to the press clippings, always aware that this story's archival edges were frayed. To remember the case is to honor the unnamed children whose lives were extinguished, and the families who bore a grief magnified by public spectacle. It is also to insist that vigilance must be both policing and human service, that protection requires both law and compassion. In the end, the secrets were pulled, sometimes reluctantly, from water and record, from the mouths of witnesses and the margins of municipal ledgers. They do not offer neat closure. They leave us with a ledger of both action and omission. The Hanover Vampire, an epithet that public imagination favored, was less a supernatural predator than a human actor operating within a social failure. The river taught the city that some secrets refuse concealment forever. Others linger, receding and returning like currents, requiring continual attention. Those who study this episode today should carry two cautions: to name what evidence supports, and to mark what remains speculative. Where documents blur names into indefinido tokens, resist fixing them without corroboration. Where rumors once bridged the gap between grief and explanation, remember that rumor is not evidence. Above all, center the human cost, the legal verdicts, the medical notations, the archival photographs. All are instruments by which we may keep memory honest. The city of Hanover had to live with the consequences of the revelations. It altered some practices, debated others, and left many wounds to heal slowly. The secrets that surfaced changed the conversation about public responsibility. They asked the community a question that outlived the trial. What will you do differently when the most vulnerable among you walk alone across a station platform? The answers are partial, and the work is ongoing.